obeyed without ever saying it aloud. The poor were invisible, and it was rude to notice them at all. Eleanor Vance had broken that rule exactly once, and it had cost her everything. She stood now at the edge of the crowded market square, clutching a threadbare reticule that held the entirety of her worldly fortune. 4 shillings, a letter of poor character, and a single reference too damning to ever show a prospective employer. 3 weeks ago she had been a governess in a respectable household. Now she was simply a woman nobody wanted, walking through Bath with nowhere left to walk to. She told herself it hadn't been a mistake. She had only refused to stand by while Mr. Pemberton raised his hand to a 6-year-old girl for spilling ink. She had stepped between them. She had said, quite calmly, that he would strike the child over her own body first. It had felt like the only decent thing a person could do. The dismissal had come within the hour. Eleanor pulled her worn shawl tighter and kept walking, past stalls of ribbon and bread and gossip, doing her best impression of a woman with somewhere to be. That was when she heard the laughter, the cruel kind, the kind with teeth in it. A cluster of young gentlemen had surrounded an old man near the fish stalls. He was filthy, his coat in rags, his silver hair matted beneath a hat that had lost its shape years ago. He swayed on his feet, clearly disoriented, murmuring something no one was bothering to listen to. At the center of the mockery stood a young viscount in an absurdly tall beaver hat, prodding the old man's shoulder with his walking stick like he was testing whether a dead thing would move. "Dance for us, old fool," the viscount drawled, to the delight of his friends. "Surely a vagrant knows how to earn his supper." The old man stumbled. No one in the crowd moved. It was, after all, terribly poor form to intervene in someone else's amusement. Eleanor felt the old familiar heat rise at the back of her neck, the same heat that had gotten her dismissed 3 weeks prior. She knew exactly what it would cost her to feel it again. She let it burn anyway. She crossed the square without hurrying, because hurrying looked like fear and she had none left to spare. "That is quite enough," she said. The viscount turned, delighted by the novelty of being addressed by a woman in a dress that had been mended twice at the hem. "And who," he said, looking her up and down with theatrical disdain, "asked for your opinion?" "No one," Eleanor said. "I am giving it regardless. You will let this man alone, or I will make certain every household in Bath hears exactly how Viscount Harwick amuses himself of an afternoon, tormenting old men who cannot defend themselves." A ripple of laughter went through the onlookers, though not at her expense this time. The Viscount's face reddened. He was, Eleanor had gambled correctly, far more afraid of ridicule than of her. "Filthy beggar isn't worth the trouble," he muttered, and stalked off with his friends trailing behind him, their laughter now aimed backward instead of forward. Eleanor turned to the old man, gentling her voice the way she once had for frightened children. "Sir? Are you hurt?" He straightened slower than she expected, and when he lifted his head, his eyes were sharp, startlingly, incongruously sharp for a man the crowd had dismissed as senile. He studied her for a long moment, as though she were a puzzle he hadn't anticipated solving today. "No," he said. His voice, when it came, was cultured in a way his coat was not. "Merely, tired of being looked through." "I understand that better than you'd think," Eleanor said, and offered her arm without a second thought for how it looked. A governess with no post walking arm in arm with a beggar through the middle of Bath. "Let me help you home, sir?" The old man's mouth curved, faint and knowing. "That," he said quietly, "is the first time in 11 years anyone in this city has offered." She left him at the corner of Milsom Street, where he insisted, with surprising firmness, that he could manage the rest of the way alone. Eleanor thought little more of it, one small mercy in a day that had offered her none, and spent that night in a rented room counting her 4 shillings by candlelight, wondering how many days they would last. 3 days later, a carriage arrived outside her lodging house. Not a hired hack, a private carriage, black lacquered and crested, drawn by a matched pair that had never once pulled a plow. The footman who knocked on her door held an envelope sealed in wax, addressed in a hand too elegant to belong to anyone she knew. Eleanor broke the seal with trembling fingers. "Miss Vance, you are requested at Rothmere Hall at your earliest convenience, regarding a position in service to the household. Transportation has been arranged. J. Ashford, Earl of Rothmere." She read it 3 times before the truth settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The old man in the ragged coat. The eyes too sharp for a beggar. Tired of being looked through. He was an earl. And he had sent for her. Rothmere Hall rose out of the Somerset countryside like something carved rather than built, grey stone, ivy climbing the east wing, windows that seemed to watch the drive as the carriage approached. Eleanor's hands did not stop trembling until the carriage had fully stopped. She was shown not to a drawing room to wait, but directly into a study, where a fire burned despite the mild afternoon and a man stood with his back to her, staring out the window with his hands clasped behind him like a soldier awaiting a verdict. He did not look like his father. Where the old Earl's eyes had held warmth beneath their sharpness, this man's profile, carved jaw, dark hair threaded early with gray at the temples, shoulders set with the particular rigidity of a man who trusted nothing and no one, held only winter. Miss Vance. He did not turn. My father tells me you accosted a viscount in the middle of a public market on his behalf. I told a bully to behave like a man instead of a child, Eleanor said. If that is accosting, then yes. That made him turn. Nathaniel Ashford's eyes were the same storm gray as his father's, but where Josiah's had softened with age, his son's had hardened with something closer to grief. He studied her the way a man studies a debt he suspects he cannot afford. My father has apparently decided you are to be governess to my daughter, he said, each word measured and cold. Without consulting me. Without a reference beyond his own whim. And without, I imagine, any understanding of what it costs this family every time a stranger is let inside these walls. I did not ask to be brought here, my lord, Eleanor said, refusing to drop her eyes, though every instinct told her a governess ought to. Your father made the offer. I am not in a position to refuse honest work, and I will not apologize for accepting it. Everyone who comes through that door wants something, Nathaniel said low and hard. Money. A title by marriage. Access to my name. Tell me now, Miss Vance, so we needn't waste each other's time later. What is it you want? Eleanor held his gaze, and for the first time that day, she let the old familiar heat show plainly on her face. At present, my lord, she said, I would settle for you speaking to me as though I were a person, and not a thief you haven't caught yet. Silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn wire. Something flickered behind his eyes, surprise perhaps, or the ghost of respect he wasn't yet willing to grant her outright. We shall see, Miss Vance, he said finally, turning back to the window. We shall see. Behind him, unnoticed by either of them, the study door stood slightly ajar, and old Josiah Ashford, leaning on his cane in the corridor, allowed himself a quiet, satisfied smile. The child's name was Margaret, and she had not spoken a full sentence to an adult in 8 months. Eleanor learned this on her first morning, from a nervous housekeeper who delivered the information the way one might warn a guest about a loose stare. Since her mother passed, miss, the little one just went quiet. His lordship's tried everyone. Tutors, physicians, a woman from London who charged a fortune to sit and stare at her for an hour. Eleanor found Margaret in the nursery, 7 years old and small for her age, sitting very still at a window seat with a book open on her lap that she was not reading. She had her father's storm-gray eyes, but where his held winter, hers held only a kind of careful, exhausted silence. The silence of a child who has learned that speaking invites people to leave. Eleanor did not attempt conversation. She simply sat on the floor near the window at a respectful distance, and began mending a torn hem from her own skirt with the needle and thread she'd brought from her old post. She said nothing for nearly an hour. When she finally spoke, it was not to Margaret at all. I find sewing rather calming, she said, to no one in particular. Especially when the day has been unkind. Margaret's eyes flicked toward her, then away. But the following morning, when Eleanor returned to the nursery with her mending basket, she found the girl had moved her window seat 2 feet closer to where Eleanor had sat the day before. It took 9 days before Margaret spoke her first word to Eleanor. It was blue, offered quietly while pointing at a length of ribbon in Eleanor's basket, and Eleanor had to turn away quickly so the child would not see her cry. Nathaniel noticed before he meant to. He told himself he was merely monitoring the situation, a father's due diligence regarding a stranger given unsupervised access to his daughter. That was the explanation he offered himself the first time he found an excuse to pass the nursery corridor at the hour he knew Eleanor read to Margaret. It was the explanation he clung to the second time and the third. By the second week he had stopped pretending the visits were accidental. He watched from the doorway one afternoon as Eleanor helped Margaret braid ribbon into her hair, the two of them laughing quietly over some private joke he wasn't part of, and felt something crack loose in his chest that he had kept carefully bricked over since his wife's funeral. She hasn't laughed like that in a year, he said, when Eleanor noticed him in the doorway and rose, startled, smoothing her skirts. Children don't stop being children, my lord, Eleanor said. They simply wait for it to be safe again. He studied her the way he had that first day in his study, as though searching for the seam where her honesty would eventually split open into some hidden motive. He found, disquietingly, that he was beginning to doubt one existed. You never ask me for anything, he said. It came out almost like an accusation. Should I? Everyone does. Eventually. His jaw tightened. Higher wages. A better room. An introduction to my acquaintance in town who might offer marriage instead of service. Eleanor met his eyes steadily. I have been offered better wages twice this month, my lord, by mothers eager to lure me away from a household with, in their words, a cold master and a broken child. I have refused both. If I wanted an easier post, I would not still be here. Something shifted behind his eyes, not quite warmth, but the absence of the frost he wore like armor. Then why are you still here, Miss Vance? Eleanor glanced back at Margaret, now humming quietly to herself over her ribbons. Because some things, once begun, are worth finishing properly. Nathaniel said nothing. But he did not find an excuse to leave the doorway for another quarter hour. Lady Cordelia Fenwick arrived at Rothmere Hall 3 weeks later, uninvited and entirely unbothered by the fact. She was a widow of considerable beauty and considerably more ambition, and she had spent the better part of 2 years positioning herself as the only sensible remedy to Nathaniel's grief, sensible, in her own estimation, meaning wealthy, well-connected, and patient enough to wait out his mourning until it became fashionable for him to remarry. She took one look at Eleanor pouring tea in the drawing-room and understood, with the swift accuracy of a woman who had built her life on reading rooms correctly, exactly what she was looking at. How resourceful of you, Nathaniel, Cordelia said sweetly, once Eleanor had excused herself, hiring your daughter's governess directly off the street. One does wonder what other bargains she's willing to make for a man in your position. Careful, Cordelia. I only worry for you, she said, settling herself with practiced grace. A woman with no family, no reference worth the paper, dismissed from her last post under circumstances no one seems quite able to explain. Surely you've wondered why a woman like that ended up begging in a market square in the first place. Nathaniel's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still. I have not wondered. I have simply asked her. And she told you the truth, I'm sure, Cordelia said, with a smile that suggested precisely the opposite. That night, for the first time since Eleanor's arrival, Nathaniel found himself unable to sleep for reasons that had nothing to do with old grief. The rumor reached the servants' hall within a week, and from there, inevitably, it reached Eleanor herself, that she had been dismissed from her previous post not for defending a child, but for something far less forgivable, an affair with the master of the house or a theft never proven, depending on which version of the story one preferred. Cordelia had been thorough. She had made certain there were several versions to choose from. Eleanor said nothing in her own defense to anyone in the house. She had learned, 3 weeks and a lifetime ago, exactly what happened to women who raised their voices in rooms full of people determined not to hear them. But Nathaniel found her in the library 2 nights later, staring at a book she wasn't reading, in an echo of the very first way he'd seen his own daughter grieve in silence. Tell me what happened, he said quietly. The truth. Not what Cordelia's been pouring into every ear in this house. Eleanor looked up, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Rothmere Hall, exhaustion cracked through her composure. Why should it matter what I say, my lord? You've already decided, along with everyone else, that a woman with no fortune and no family must be lying about something. I asked because I already made inquiries, Nathaniel said. 3 days ago. I wrote to the Pemberton household myself. Eleanor went very still. The housekeeper confirmed it, he continued, quieter now. Word for word. You put yourself between a child and a raised hand, and you were dismissed within the hour for the trouble of it. He paused. I should have asked you directly from the start. Instead I let a woman with her own ambitions plant doubt where none should have existed. That is a failure of mine, not yours. Eleanor's throat tightened. Why did you look into it at all? Nathaniel's jaw worked as though the answer cost him something to give. Because in 3 weeks you have never once lied to me, flattered me, or asked me for a single thing beyond fair wages for honest work. And because my daughter speaks again, Miss Vance. For the first time since her mother died, she speaks. His voice dropped lower. I find I am no longer willing to let anyone, Cordelia included, decide what that's worth. The fire popped softly in the grate. Neither of them moved to fill the silence that followed because for the first time, it did not feel like something that needed filling. She'll try again, Eleanor said finally. Lady Fenwick. Women like her don't stop at one attempt. No, Nathaniel agreed, something hard and resolved settling into his expression. She won't. So we had best be ready for her when she does. The midsummer ball at Rothmere Hall had not been held in 3 years, not since Nathaniel's wife had died and taken with her any appetite he'd had for candlelight and orchestras. That he chose to hold it now, and that he insisted Eleanor attend as a guest rather than remain upstairs with Margaret, told the household everything it needed to know, whether or not anyone said so aloud. Cordelia Fenwick arrived precisely on time, dressed in wine-red silk that cost more than Eleanor's wages for a year, and wearing the particular smile of a woman who has already decided how the evening will end. She waited until the ballroom was fullest, until half of Somerset's gentry stood within easy earshot, before she made her move. "Miss Vance." Cordelia's voice carried, pitched precisely to draw attention rather than avoid it. "How brave of you to show your face among decent company, given the circumstances of your last dismissal." The room's chatter dimmed by degrees, the way it always did when cruelty announced itself as gossip. "I'm not certain what you mean, my lady," Eleanor said evenly, though her pulse had begun to hammer. "Come now. Everyone in this room has heard some version of the story," Cordelia continued, savoring it. "A governess turned out of her post for improper conduct with the master of the house. One does wonder what conduct, precisely, earned her a place in this household so quickly after." A ripple of scandalized murmurs moved through the assembled guests. Eleanor felt the old familiar heat rise in her chest, not fear, but the particular fury of a woman watching a lie put on and worn like a fine coat in public. Before she could speak, Nathaniel's voice cut across the ballroom, cold and absolute. "That is enough, Cordelia." He crossed the floor with the same measured, unhurried tread Eleanor had once used to cross a market square, and came to stand beside her rather than in front of her, a distinction she suspected he had chosen deliberately. Miss Vance was dismissed from her previous post, Nathaniel said loud enough that the entire ballroom could hear, for placing herself between a 6-year-old child and a man raising his hand to strike her. "I have the housekeeper's written account, obtained directly, should anyone here care to doubt it over a rumor manufactured by a woman with every motive to lie." Cordelia's smile faltered. "Nathaniel, surely you don't mean to embarrass me in front of—" "I mean to stop you," he said, "from doing to Miss Vance what was done to my daughter for a year after her mother died, deciding without evidence that silence and grief were something shameful rather than something to be protected." A stooped figure at the edge of the crowd chose that moment to step forward, leaning on his cane, silver hair now washed and combed, dressed in a coat that finally matched his station rather than concealing it. Several guests gasped audibly, the Earl of Rothmere, whom half of them had assumed too reclusive to ever attend his own ball, let alone speak. "I met Miss Vance," Josiah Ashford said, his voice carrying with surprising strength, "in a market square disguised as a beggar, being tormented by a young viscount for the entertainment of a crowd too polite to intervene. She was the only person among dozens who did." His gaze swept the room, settling last on Cordelia. "I have lived a long life, Lady Fenwick, and met a great many people scheming for my family's fortune. Miss Vance is not one of them. I would stake what remains of my name on it." The silence that followed was absolute. Cordelia, for the first time in Eleanor's brief acquaintance with her, appeared to have run entirely out of words. She excused herself minutes later, and was gone from Somerset by morning, along with whatever remained of her campaign. Nathaniel found Eleanor afterward on the terrace, away from the music and the candlelight, staring out at the dark garden with her arms wrapped around herself against the night air. "You didn't have to do that," she said without turning. "Defend me so publicly. It will be talked about for weeks. Let them talk." He came to stand beside her at the balustrade. "I am done arranging my life around what is convenient for other people's gossip." Eleanor turned to face him. "I am a governess, my lord. A woman with no fortune, no family name worth mentioning, and a reputation that will always have a shadow on it, however unearned. Whatever this is," she gestured faintly between them, "it cannot end anywhere sensible." "Good," Nathaniel said. "I have had a great deal of sensible in my life, Miss Vance. It has made me cold, and it made my daughter silent for a year, and I am finished with it." He reached into his coat and drew out a small worn box, offering it to her without ceremony. "This belonged to my mother. She married beneath what society thought she deserved, and my father always said it was the only decision in his life he never once regretted." Eleanor's hands trembled as she took it. "You are asking a governess to marry an earl's son." "I am asking a woman who never once lied to me, flattered me, or asked me for anything," Nathaniel said quietly, "to stop finishing other people's stories properly and start on one of her own. With me if she'll have it." Eleanor looked down at the box, then up at him, at the winter finally gone from his eyes, replaced with something unguarded and terrified and entirely sincere. "I will not be a quiet countess," she warned, though her voice had begun to break with something that was not sorrow. I will speak my mind. I will defend anyone I find being wronged regardless of how it looks. I will not curtsy simply because it is expected. I am counting on it, Nathaniel said, and the smile that broke across his face was the first genuine one she had ever seen there. A quiet house very nearly finished us both. 3 months later, Rothmere Hall hosted a wedding smaller than anyone in Somerset expected of an earl's heir, a private ceremony in the estate's own chapel, witnessed by a beaming Margaret in a new blue ribbon, a proud and thoroughly recovered Josiah Ashford leaning on his cane in the front pew, and a scattering of servants who had watched the whole courtship unfold from doorways and corridors, and were not the least bit surprised by how it ended. As Nathaniel kissed his new wife before the small gathered crowd, old Josiah Ashford smiled the same knowing smile he'd worn in that Bath Market Square months before. The smile of a man who had gone looking for someone worth trusting, and found in the last place society thought to look, a woman who had never once been willing to look away.